Hello everyone and welcome to VideoNet's live webcast entitled Delivering Compelling Multiscreen Services, which is about how media companies can deliver multi-screen services that meet the needs of the digital-first youth demographic and the wider OTT viewing public. I'm Barry Flynn, I'm contributing editor at VideoNet who are hosting this webcast, and I'm your moderator for the next hour. A little bit of explanation and housekeeping before I introduce the panel and kick off. Now that you're logged into the webcast portal, you'll see that you can ask questions. We do encourage you to use this facility, but please do keep your questions short. It's easier for us to display and read them at this end. We'll store up audience questions and direct them to our panelists at the end of each of the three sections of this webcast. So now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers to you. They are first up Matt Smith, Chief Evangelist at Envato, who are sponsoring this webinar. For those of you who may not know, Envato is a US-based company that provides an end-to-end video streaming platform which combines live and on-demand video publishing, broadcast quality distribution, reporting, and monetization for both web and mobile. Then we have Dr. Daniel Hesselbart, who is responsible for product innovations on TV and broadband at cable company Unity Media, which runs Liberty Global's operations in Germany. And finally, Richard Broughton, Research Director at analyst firm Ampere Analysis, which specializes in pay and multi-screen TV and next-generation content distribution. So, to recap what this webinar is all about, we're going to kick off by looking at the major developments in multi-screen consumption in Europe, including the digital-first trend, which began with millennials, and discussing, among other things, how that's spreading outwards to other demographics. Then we'll examine how and why it's becoming easier to bring online multi-screen services to market, and what technologies are involved in doing that. And finally, we'll focus on how the multi-screen opportunity can best be monetized through syndication and online advertising. So let's start with multi-screen consumption. At this point, I'd like to take advantage of the fact that Ampere Analysis has done some recent research into multi-screen consumption trends in Europe and give Richard the opportunity to look at some of the overarching themes. So, Richard, what are the trends you're seeing?
Oh, thanks, Barry. If we could show the first slide, please. So I thought we'd begin with a quick example to bring this to life of what the UK TV and media sector looks like at the moment. So if you look at the overall pie in the middle, it's basically dividing the revenue that's coming into the industry into a few different chunks. So you can see the pay TV services over on the left, Sky, Virgin Media, the TV broadcasters at the bottom in yellow, ITVs, Channel 4s and so on, the online advertising sector, which is now worth about a third of the market, the subscription on demand sector up in the top right. And what I hope is fairly obvious to the attendees here is that actually how little some of the online video services are actually contributing to the economy at the moment in terms of direct monetization. So the entire subscription video on demand market is only worth about 2% of the overall pie. And if you look at the online video advertising sector, so the social video services like YouTube, Facebook, etc., as well as the catch-up services and newspaper group-led services, they only represent about 8% of that online advertising segment. So still relatively small. But this is changing pretty rapidly. So Barry, if you could show the next slide. So actually what we're seeing is a series of transition points, tipping points, you could call them, in that various different drivers are taking over as the force behind growth in the media market. And I hope what's, again, immediately obvious here is the growth of two segments there. So one in orange, the online advertising market, which has already, in Western Europe, overtaken the broadcast TV space and is about to overtake the pay TV sector as contributing more revenue to the market. And similarly at the bottom, the subscription online video market, and the Netflixes, Amazons and equivalents, it's not likely to overtake pay TV anytime soon, but its share of revenue is increasing pretty rapidly. And we can see effects on the ways in which consumers are watching content. If we show the next slide, what we're seeing increasingly is that households are moving away from pay TV platforms. Now, you could call that cord cutting, or I've heard others call it cord nevers, but either way, what this chart is illustrating is that an increased proportion of people are taking subscription video on demand as their main TV service. So you can see we've interviewed 21,000 internet users in 2 waves of surveys here, and what these bars are illustrating is the proportion of households, the proportion of respondents who say that subscription video on demand is their main TV service, perhaps taken alone or perhaps taken in combination with a free-to-air broadcast platform. And that's particularly high, as you might expect, in some of the more connected markets, Scandinavia, UK, US, but also markets like Germany, Italy, Spain, rising quickly as new services are deployed. So some changing consumption patterns. And we can also see, finally, if we move on to the next slide, how different age groups are trending with regards to consumption. So this is showing the expressed or claimed viewing in terms of minutes by different age groups of different types of service. So on-demand, broadcast, DVR, and you can see there's a stark difference between the younger consumers on the left-hand side who are watching more on demand, and the older consumers who are watching more linear broadcast. So as the age effects propagate through over the next decade or two, we will obviously start to see significant shifts in multi-screen viewing.
Okay, thanks for that, Richard. Daniel and Matt, Daniel first, I guess. How does that picture, which is kind of UK and European based, are there big differences in Germany in how these online trends are developing with video?
Barry, thanks. This is Daniel speaking. For Germany, I can only confirm what has been said here. It is just the same behavior. We do see trends, interestingly, in Germany that, let's say, online video, Netflix adoption, for example, is slower than in other markets. And from a Liberty Global point of view, we can compare markets quite nicely, actually. So from a pure, let's say, adoption point of view, we see that, yes, it is increasing, but as we saw in the slides just now, it is not yet huge, but obviously it is growing.
Right. And Matt, how about the US? Any observations from your side of the pond?
Sure. There's no denying the Netflix juggernaut, clearly a major player in the space, but we're seeing trends that do show that some of the live channel offerings are being met with uptake. You've got services like Verizon's Go 90, Dish Network, Sling TV that are offering live channels to viewers who want them as a takeaway service or take with, something I'll call mobile only. And let's not forget about the impact of live sport and live news. Those are two things that don't necessarily fit into what I'll call the live linear bucket because we can't really record, program those, and offer them as a live linear service. The other thing that we're seeing here is that clever move by some very recognizable broadcast brands who are scheduling shows at a time where people will make appointment viewing important. And I'll point to we just finished the season of Game of Thrones on HBO here in the US. So those types of things are influencing live consumption. It's certainly not outpacing VOD, but we are seeing live kind of have its own moment in the sun right now with regard to OTT.
Okay. Thanks very much, Daniel and Matt, for those comments. Richard, if we go back to talking about the younger age groups and in particular digital-first consumers, the people whose first look service is not a traditional one, are they confined to millennials, or is that a trend that's broadening out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's certainly something which skews towards millennials. So I think we have another slide on this, if you could bring it up. We surveyed a range of internet users across Europe and US about viewing habits, and about 30% of them identified as OTT first. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're watching more OTT content, but they identify that online video services are the main way, the most important way that they watch TV. And you can see from this that in the blue bar here, which represents the proportion of consumers who identify as online first by age bucket, that about half of them skew into the millennial group. So it's certainly, they over-index relative to what you'd expect from a typical population distribution. But as you can also see, there's still another 50% that aren't in that group. So a substantial number of older consumers are identifying as OTT first as well. But I think there's a key point here that there are still differences between those groups, that the services they rely on do differ by age. So younger consumers, for instance, over-index for social video services, Facebook video, for instance, while older consumers tend to skew towards viewing on broadcaster catch-up services. So while we do see both age groups increasingly identifying as OTT first, engaging with online video first and foremost, the sorts of companies they're typically engaging with does differ slightly.
Right. Okay. Daniel, how does it look from a cable operator's point of view in Europe? Do you see that the same thing? Are your cable customers, do their profiles tend to be much older than the population at large, or do you see a more even distribution?
I think the overarching scheme is that there is not one customer, and the customer groups that we have and that we need to be serving and that we need to be, speaking to in terms of customer communication, advertising, etc., is entirely is immensely diverse. So yes, we do have obviously older customers, the 40, 45 plus to a large extent in our basic cable services. But on the other hand, we have quite competitive broadband services, for example, also IP-only services with huge broadbands. Good response times, which actually speaks to a gaming community, for example. So all customer groups are amongst ours. What we need to do, and where we are, only in the beginning of serving and building products against, is moving, our entire product chain to all our customers. So we have basic cable services for the elderly or the older customers, and we have IP services for the younger. But what we need to do is to get entertainment and video consumption also to younger customer groups. This is what we are trying with our own OTT services, and not leave, everything to the Netflixes of the world.
Do you think it's reasonable to suppose that? There are some people who say that they won't need TV sets at all. Is that a likelihood, or do you think there will always be a substantial proportion of your audience who favor linear broadcast on a traditional TV set?
Well, honestly, that's a threat more to the TV set manufacturers, isn't it? For us, we don't care too much where the content is consumed on that we are serving into the households, whether it's an iPad or a big screen or an iPhone. And we do see that the usage is indeed increasingly varying or diverse also there. Now, having said that, obviously we do have a set-top box, and that is our main service still. But also that is changing. I do believe that people will like a big screen in their household, or a beamer for that matter, so something which is big and established in one room simply because it's big. And in addition, there we use other platforms, other displays to use content. But there will be households different from let's say 10 or 20 years ago. There will be households which do not have a TV screen. Indeed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I want to move on to how the content mix is changing, and whether, as many people have supposed, the proportion of long tail and niche content that is available from video catalogs online is increasing. Richard, would you like to address that? I think you've got some stats about that as well.
Yes, exactly. So I think we've got a slide 8, which deals partly with this. So we've seen some sort of structural and strategic differences emerging here. So in theory, online video lends pretty significant opportunities to niche content providers compared to broadcast platforms. The fixed costs are often lower, and that means that benefits services without large audience scale. Their costs grow as their audiences grow. So in theory, yes. What we've actually found for a number of services, particularly some of the top subscription video on demand services, is that they're moving away from provisioning long tail content. So what this chart is illustrating at the moment is the size of Netflix's US catalogue by age category. So from June 2015, the catalogue has declined from about 7,000 different titles to losing about 1,000 titles to currently. What that difference is really composed of is older content. So we've seen the oldest age bracket of titles on Netflix really decline. And similarly, if we move to the next slide, the change is slightly subtler. What we're also tracking is sort of the rating of these titles, how much either they've been consumed or how high quality they are in terms of user reviews. The ratings have generally slowly increased as well. So what we started to find for services like Netflix is that the catalogue has, yes, it's decreased in size. They've actually removed some of that long tail of content, and they're focusing on a narrower form of entertainment. And I think this is quite an important point, actually, because while services like YouTube and Facebook obviously have a huge range of long-tail content, catering to every different sort of niche genre that you can think of, in a pretty fragmented world, having a solid brand associated with key content is an important marker to help consumers better navigate and find the content they want to watch. So I think while we start to see services, I think we've got one more slide here, like Amazon, create opportunities for niche content services. So through their partner program, there are a whole range of different niche video services emerging. It's also important to create a brand. You can't necessarily be everything to everyone. You need to have a core focus to help consumers find the content they want to watch.
Okay, so keeping with the content theme, what's happening? Maybe Matt, this is one for you. What's happening to things like live local broadcast channels, live news, and weather? Are you seeing amongst your customers that people expect those kind of things to be available on second screens as well, or is it, as it were, those staples confined to traditional TV screens rather than second screens?
We do, absolutely. Very good question. We are hearing feedback and we're seeing data in terms of consumption from our customers that show that live local news is important, it's viable, it's something that viewers want because it's locally curated, right? It has relevance to those viewers in whatever city or region that they live in. Like you mentioned, weather as well. Weather is important to them. So having that stream available to them, either in the moment or if they want to come back and watch it later, is important. Further, we're seeing the broadcast community really begin to embrace this because of dynamic ad insertion, where they can deliver very relevant ads to these users where they are, because we have additional targeting data. We know where that device is with, pardon me, with GPS or with postal code or zip code information. So definitely a viable service. We're seeing uptake, and it's something that sector is embracing quite a bit amongst our customer base.
Hmm. Daniel, does that fit with your experience in Europe, that people actually want those staples like local channels, local broadcast channels, news and weather, also to be available on different screens?
Absolutely. As I said before, it does not matter to the customer really what screen it is on. It must meet the let's say the viewing behavior that the customer is in at this very moment. So he might take his iPad to the bedroom or whatever. So yes, they must be there. It's not only it's nice to have them there, they must be there. And they are there, really. I mean, you have apps from every single broadcaster, obviously. The, let's say, decisive question is, how do you get a good and, let's say, elegant integrated offer to the customer in order to, let's say, support viewing habits and get them the same feeling, the same user experience, the same content discovery tools in particular also on those different screens.
Right, okay. So in other words, whatever their current preference has to be, they need to watch whatever genre they want when they want it, I suppose. And the other way we could flip it is to ask how they're finding the content. So Daniel also wanted to ask you whether you're finding an increasing number of people locating the content they want to watch on your cable systems via social media. Is that a noticeable trend?
Well, content discovery is crucial already now and will become even more crucial in the future. I mean, content is getting more and more really, and more platforms and more choice. So, let's say similar to Google revolutionizing search, content discovery is something that needs to be cracked. And we have, let's say, a couple of tools we are applying here. Obviously, the content discovery engine, let's say, needs to fit the screen that you're on, and also the navigational principles. So whether you have an RCU at hand or a touch screen, so that'll differ there. But the tools to apply there are extremely important. Social media also plays a role. Honestly, what we're not seeing is that, let's say, people hopping from Facebook to our offering and back. It's not that kind of, let's say, social engagement, but they do want to engage and they want to share what they're currently viewing, etc. Rights, last sentence for me, rights in that matter is, let's say, quite a, so content rights is what I'm speaking about. That's quite a challenge, really, because obviously, even though people would like to, let's say, share a clip of Big Bang Theory in Facebook that they have just been watching on our service, from a rights perspective, that's quite difficult to actually apply.
You mean to share the clip that they've discovered, or
exactly.
to actually? Yeah. But is there a parallel problem with in your content discovery mechanism, having people look for products that aren't available? I mean, is there not some element of disappointment likely from seeing something on social media that they can't get on your system?
Well, that's also a challenge. You're absolutely right. Of course, people expect, let's say, a lot, and from a media aggregator as we are, they, let's say, want to find everything on the one platform, and if it's not there, it is disappointing. We do apply certain, let's say, guidance tools so that the customer always finds something, or that what he finds, that the situation that he's really not finding anything is not really happening. But apart from finding, again, let's say the the guided discovery is extremely important. People don't want to search all the time, but they want to be recommended something they probably like because of their viewing habits. So you get into in particular in Germany again into data protection issues, because you need to, let's say, monitor and watch what the customer has viewed. Now, in an internet space, that is quite common, and let's say everyone just clicks away Google's terms and conditions. On a television screen, people are not so used in doing that. So getting, let's say, data protection issues right in these platforms is quite a challenge, in particular if you go pan-European.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, thanks for that comprehensive answer, Daniel. Matt, you wanted to chime in on the social media discovery question?
Yes, please. I just would add to the comments, which I think we're spot on, that we're seeing a lot of broadcast brands and those who offer this content use the social networks as a channel to embrace audience that is connecting on those platforms. So, if it's a news event or if it's a sport highlight, we're seeing them use and I would say that the tools have to be efficient and simple so that this isn't a very tedious process. It must flow very nicely along with traditional broadcast operations. So we are seeing customers, though, that will cut a sport highlight or a breaking news element and embrace those audiences in Facebook and Twitter because it's an extension of their brand. So that, we just a short time ago, 18 to 24 months ago, we would see broadcast brands put a clip out there and then have people link through to the site to actually watch it or, just to redirect them. Now we're seeing more of a trend where they're staying in that feed on Twitter or Facebook and letting the audience consume the content there. I would also echo Daniel's comment where, I see it as a tool where people can engage with the content. And sure, Facebook and Twitter are experimenting with live feeds on those products. In fact, I'd point you to Twitter and the NFL that are going to try this fall. But we see the trend being one where those who operate many channels are still going to be the prevalent way of viewing. I don't see Facebook and Twitter having 50 channels that someone can switch back and forth from. Maybe one or two, but I think we still see that social arm as an extension of that broadcast brand.
Okay, thanks for that, Matt. I was going to pose some questions at this point. I've got two, but they don't really relate to anything that has gone so far. But question one, will these slides or webinar be available? Yes, they will be later to watch for people who can't make the live version. I think one person from Bright Cove had no audio. If any others of the audience have problems with audio, please post more questions. I'm not aware that anyone has had any audio problems so far, but please let us know if you are having audio problems by posing a question about that. So let's go on to section two. Yes, I'm getting at least one person saying no problem here. Thanks for that. Section two is about the new deployment and operations paradigm. So the thinking is that there are new ways of deploying your services if you're an operator or a broadcaster, which make it much easier to satisfy the content fulfillment requirements we've been talking about in the first section of this webinar. I wanted to invite Daniel, first of all, to answer the question, is it becoming easier to bring online multi-screen services to market now? 5 years ago, it was quite difficult to do all these kind of quite sophisticated things we've been talking about. Is the progress continuing?
It is absolutely. It is much easier now than, as you just mentioned, 5 years ago, and that for a multitude of reasons. For one is obviously the let's say technology solutions have become much better, cheaper, and easier to implement. That is one thing. The other thing is, again, on content rights. 5 years ago, IP content rights were, or let's say 8 years ago, IP content rights, so content rights for IP streaming for, let's say, a classical pay TV channel or broadcast channel was a bit more exotic than it is now. And also then our own, let's say, cultural change that we needed to go through, being a more established cable operator coming from, let's say, classical cable television. Also, we had to change in terms of speed of development and customer centricity and these kinds of things to indeed, let's say, embrace those kinds of to embrace those developments and not say they're evil, which, let's say, some people in our company said 8 to 10 years ago. So it is really a change on various components of the entire equation.
So, Matt, I mean, why is it becoming easier? To what do you attribute that? I mean, you are able to create products for your customers now that allow these different online multi-screen services. What are the facilitators, the enablers from a technology point of view, I guess?
Well, as Daniel mentioned, it's never been easier. But to answer your question, Barry, it's about different thinking and different approaches to over-the-top delivery. So thinking about things in terms of software, just software-based video processing, or off-the-shelf hardware, non-proprietary iron, as I jokingly call it. We're seeing organizations large and small move from looking at this in terms of a budgeting exercise, going from capital expenditures to OpEx. The ability to scale a service and grow is infinitely easier. Streaming today has gone from what just, I'll say 24 months ago, was a cost center to a profit center. Whether it's in a small subscription fee or whether it's a dynamically ad-inserted model, we're now seeing, whether it's a single channel operator, a multi-channel operator, or a large network, look at streaming as not only table stakes but also something where they can profit from because the uptake is there. So the legacy approach of components being connected together and are kind of cobbled together, I'll say, versus an end-to-end solution, which I think we'll touch on here in a moment, has become the real movement. So it's whether you are the next Netflix or whether you are just a regional cable channel in the Netherlands, for example. Sorry, I said that 3 times fast. It's never been easier to really stand a service up like this. And I should mention that one of the fundamental changes in terms of an architecture and technology perspective is we don't have to think about what streaming format works on what screen. We've kind of leveled that playing field with the advent of Dash and HLS.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Daniel, from an operator's point of view, you can do this in the cloud. You can do all of it in the cloud if you want. What's your view? Real world, cloud, hybrid. Which environment is best from your point of view?
Well, in the end, it has to go into the cloud. If you want to make services available everywhere at any time, the only reliable source for this is the cloud. You can't rely on, let's say, the customer's home HDD environment to be available all the time. So cloud must be, let's say, our goal. The problem again there is that, let's say, content rights in particular, also, let's say, certain operational issues or legal terms, etc., don't allow us, and again, it's a bit of a German-specific problem, but not only, don't allow us to go to the cloud entirely as of today. So, for example, concepts like a network PVR simply are not covered by German law. You cannot do it unless you negotiate with each and every content provider, and you make the service available to customers, well, in a not so very convenient or clever way, because he has to click too many times. So it's not what someone would expect from a proper cloud service. But in particular, also content rights are very differing throughout Europe, for example, and that is quite a burden and a hurdle at the moment. We see that very nicely with a platform that we have deployed in several countries. We as Liberty Global, that is Horizon. Horizon has the ability to indeed record in the cloud and also do 7-day catch-up in the cloud, so that you can access virtually everything that was on air in the last week. Horizon allows that, let's say, from a technology and architectural point of view, and it is available. It's available in Switzerland, where the content rights are in a way that this is possible. And it's a service which is, it's hugely successful. People love it because it's changing the way they are watching television. You don't need to think about a start time of a show. You don't need to think about recording. Not speaking about European quarter finals, maybe. That's where you really need to be on the spot. But anyway, you could watch it later if you wanted to. So the service is there, the technology is there, the service quality is there as well. But it cannot be deployed in so many countries, including Germany, because the rights are not there. So that is where we see the biggest hurdle for successful deployment throughout Europe, which is the reason why we are working on hybrid for the time being, just as any other larger German cable operator does as well.
Okay, thanks very much for Daniel. May I pause briefly at this point and ask the audience to pose some questions? We haven't had any yet so far, which is most unusual. But please, we welcome any of your questions about what our panelists are saying, and we will endeavour to answer them in the Q&A sessions at the end. Matt, what's best to take? Because you can cobble together a whole lot of different solutions, as you put it, or you can create an end-to-end solution to do all these things, whether it's hybrid or cloud-based. Which approach should broadcasters and operators take, in your view?
Well, let me start by beginning, and I'll dovetail off of what Daniel said. And I thought he had a great synopsis there at the end, which is, there aren't limitations with regard to the cloud and AVR, for example. There's no technical limitation. The architecture that exists today is very graceful. It's very powerful, but it ultimately comes down to rights. And that's important when you think about workflows, because today's OTT service is dependent on a variety of things that drive what you're able to consume on your handset, on your smartphone, on your smart TV. What I mean by that is that a particular event may be viewable in Munich, Germany, but not in London, England, for example. So today's OTT platforms must have a high level of intelligence in that cloud component, so that we can drive who can watch and who can't watch, and how many stream renditions are needed for a sport event versus a news program or even entertainment content. And is there dynamic ad insertion? Are there captions, subtitles, alternate language tracks? So there is a ton of complexity that goes into today's OTT service, because I would call your attention to the fact that we're mimicking the broadcast, but we're actually delivering a product that I like to call better than broadcast because of all these complex business requirements. So I'll wrap all that up in a bow to say, in a hypothesis, that today's most effective, most powerful OTT products and services are driven by platforms that are connected. So there's not a modular, live encoder or a separate piece just for video editing or a separate piece just for a CMS, or to manage that content. At best, they're connected via APIs, but what we find is if you've got a massive event, if you have a channel or an event that is consumed, where people are consuming a lot of that, we're about to see that with the Olympics, we've seen that with the World Cup, we've seen that with Super Bowls. When you've got massive events at scale, it can really stress individual components that are, cobbled together is the term that I'll use. Whereas if you have an end-to-end platform, all of those components are configured to work together, whether it's 1,000 streams being delivered or whether it's 1,000,000 streams being delivered. So that's not to say that you can't have an end-to-end approach that does have some modules that live outside of that workflow. You can, but these are some of the considerations to take into account, that complex business logic and rights and rules, and also scale.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, some questions are coming in, but I think what I'll do is continue on to section 3, and then we can have a good session at the end, picking some of these questions apart, because they've suddenly started streaming in, which is great to see. So section 3 of this webinar is to do with how to monetize multiscreen more effectively using syndication and online advertising. And I'd like to begin by asking Richard what the business benefits are to be had from making your content available beyond your own properties, so on platforms like YouTube, Hulu, or even Netflix, or perhaps on social media as well. Richard, what are your view of the benefits?
Yes, so there are a mixture of direct and indirect benefits to this. So by that I mean we've already heard about some of the promotional opportunities from Matt and Daniel. Talking about how you can drive awareness and uptake of shows and viewing of programming from promotional activity on social video platforms. And there are also direct benefits as well, by which I mean direct financial rewards from working with these platforms. So Barry, if you could bring up the final slide 11. So if we start with, for instance, the subscription video on demand services like Netflix and Hulu. Both of these sorts of services, and Amazon and others, all spend to acquire content. So in 2015, for instance, Netflix spent nearly $4 billion on acquired content, and it's committing to vastly increased levels of content spending through 2016, 2017. So this number's only going to increase. Similarly, Amazon's also spending not quite as much as Netflix at the moment, but still at a few billion. And of course, people may point out that, well, actually, increasing proportion of this is an original content, but even this is effectively acquired for Netflix. Netflix is basically commissioning on an exclusive basis. So there's substantial amounts of money flowing in that is available for producers and content distributors from the subscription video on demand sector. And I think one of the key things to remember in this is that although the revenues, if you remember back from one of the earlier slides, are relatively small in proportion to pay TV, the margins are also slimmer, so a larger proportion of the money that consumers spend is actually going on content. Simultaneously, we've got a whole range of other services. So again, the social video services, everything from YouTube to Facebook and so on. So YouTube offers an alternative route to monetize content. So back in 2015, again, YouTube made about $5 billion from advertising, and about $3 billion of that was returned to the content owners and networks themselves. So the multi-channel networks and the channels and the content creators. That's directly from pre-roll, mid-roll video advertising. So you've got those more immediate direct ad-funded or subscription opportunities for content creators and distributors. But there are also alternative opportunities emerging, including branding and sponsorship. So if you look at the amount of consumption on Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, on other social video services, much of this is unmonetized through traditional pre-roll or mid-roll advertising. So YouTube's obviously doing extremely well there. Facebook's bringing in its own models. But actually, the opportunity for content creators may revolve more around branded content, product placement, sponsorship on some of these other services. And these are new revenue streams that are not necessarily available via broadcast platforms.
Okay, thanks. That's really comprehensive, Richard. Thank you. So if we're going to talk about syndication, Matt, what technologies are required if you want to do that?
Sure. So today's programmer, broadcaster, generally is providing their content to a variety of different places. They're entering into syndication deals with an iTunes, a Google Play Store, OTT only services like a Netflix or a Hulu. So again, part of that workflow includes the syndication element, which shouldn't be separate from the rest of the workflow. So being able to take that feed of the off-air channel, or alternately a mezzanine file of that content, is where the process begins. And then creating all those stream renditions, alternate language tracks, captions and subtitles, so on and so forth, delivering it to those places I mentioned. But we're also seeing an emerging trend where part of the requirement is also to deliver that same show, that same piece of content to traditional destinations, an IPTV outlet or a cable channel for on-demand distribution in the living room or on that set-top box. So with one fell swoop, we are able to deliver on those requirements. And again, what that means is simplification of a workflow. That means that it is easier for a broadcast brand or a network to reach all of the endpoints and all those distribution points for their content without having to think about separate workflows. And for them, again, the trend, we've heard that in this webinar, the trend is toward that simplification and making it easier so that those who are offering content don't have to think of siloed workflows to get that content to these different destinations. And last but not least, I should say, we can't forget about Facebook and Twitter. We talked about them earlier, but syndication today also means social syndication, delivering those files in a properly formatted way to those social networks so that content can live and feed as well.
Okay, sure. Yeah, good point. Daniel, so what do content owners and service providers need to do so they can prepare their multi-screen infrastructures to monetize multi-screen consumption, for instance, via advertising? What are the steps that they need to take to exploit the advantages that Richard has mentioned?
Well, in terms of advertising, we're, let's say, maybe 2-3 years behind the general evolution on OTT usage in the first place. For one thing, advertising is, at least so far, very much in the space and in the regime of the classical content providers. In Europe and in Germany, we as cable operator have rather little proportion of the advertising cake so far, but it is in particular the private broadcasters, to some extent also the public broadcasters, that do advertising in the classical TV space. Now, also that is changing. It's changing slowly, where we as cable operators, as content aggregators, are able to do the aggregation, do the playout of services, on-demand services, for example, and add advertising to that, because we know a lot about the customers, we know where they live, we know what they are watching, or we can identify them. So that is, let's say, very good advantages for an advertising space. And again, there, the technologies will not be the limiting factor. Technologies are there already. Not everything is, let's say, implemented to a professional operational level yet, at least not in Germany and Europe, or Germany. And this is evolving, and it's evolving quickly. Again, there, it is a cultural change that needs to happen in the entire industry until this can become really successful, or as a prerequisite that this becomes really successful. And that is obviously that the let's say the previous owners of this asset, advertising, classical broadcasters, obviously need to rethink, and then also the entire advertising industry, as in media agencies, etc., need to see that classical linear advertising, which is still the currency in let's say video advertising as of today, that also needs to change. So it's a change of mindset that needs to happen as well.
Okay. Richard, this one for you. How is online and multi-screen advertising beginning to mirror what the things that traditional linear TV does, like mid-rolls and things like that? Is that well underway now, or is it a fait accompli, as it were?
It's certainly well underway. So for a lot of, particularly the catch-up broadcaster-led services, the advertising models they use for their online video services already resembles what you see in the broadcast feed. So sponsored buffers, mid-roll breaks, lasting a couple of minutes. So I think we've certainly moved away from the hesitancy that many broadcasters had around ad load that was affecting the revenues that they would be able to generate from catch-up TV services early on in their evolution. I think that's partly due to consumer maturity, that they're increasingly expecting heavier ad loads online now. Obviously, for some services and formats of content, a traditional linear model doesn't necessarily make sense. And I, as a consumer, you don't necessarily want ad breaks or extensive pre-rolls around short-form content. I know a number of news groups do this, and it's a turn-off for consumers viewing on their service, particularly where the content's non-exclusive, i.e. you can get it elsewhere. So for those services that actually adopted a traditional TV live model, I'd argue that now they need to be thinking, well, what's next? Don't just replicate TV. What other alternatives to this structure that work better, that are differentiated, that address audiences more efficiently? So I think that we need to be looking beyond replicating pure broadcast in terms of how we're fitting adverts into the streams and thinking, what can we do better?
Okay, thanks, Richard. This one for Matt. How can online multi-screen advertising begin to differentiate itself from traditional linear advertising? And Matt, if you could be brief, I'd like to devote the rest of this webinar to Q&As. So how
Sure.
can online? Yeah.
Yeah, I just echo what Richard finished with there. Is how can we do this better? And the answer is devices give us the capability to interact a bit with the consumer, with the viewer. So I foresee interactive experiences where an advertiser can target a particular group, again, in a postal code using GPS data with, maybe even a lower third graphic that pops up in the middle of the advert that you can tap on, save off a QR code or a coupon to your wallet on your device, and, walk into that coffee shop 50 yards or I'll say 10 meters down the street and redeem that and save, a couple of pounds, euros, or dollars on your coffee. So I see those interactive ad experiences being something we'll see soon, and that interaction the targeting the viewer specific to those devices and locations being a way that this will improve.
Okay, thanks very much for that, and for keeping it short. We've got a whole load of questions that have come in, so let me start. Actually, Matt, it looks as if this one is one for you. With the advent of HEVC and AV1 codecs, how do you see them impacting the unity of playback you mentioned earlier?
It's a very good question. Thank you for it, audience. I think we will have an impact. The challenge there is, as the audience may know, is getting onto the device. A prevalent codec to be effective, an effective delivery mechanism, must be on a majority of devices: Android, iOS, tablet, smartphone, even set-top box, and devices like a Roku or Amazon Fire TV. HEVC will have a role there, but it's going to take time for all the device manufacturers to adopt that standard. I mean, you know, any video codec out there is only as effective as the number of devices that we can deliver it to. The compression is important, and that means we'll be able to get better quality, higher channel count, and those types of things. But again, we've got to have the audience and the devices in that audience be compatible with that format.
Okay, thanks for that. That question was from John Pomeroy at Inca Networks, by the way. Thank you for it. Here's one from Russ Armstrong at Delphico. I think it's best for Daniel. Do service providers procure channels with multi-screen deployment in mind? Daniel.
Well, we do now. That was part of the cultural change that we had to undergo. Obviously, again, let's say 5 years ago, that was not in the focus. It was not in our focuses, but not in the focus of the content providers either. Now, and actually since a couple of years now, obviously acquiring all the rights that we need for our services is, well, part of the deal, let's say. And the good thing is both sides want it. Both sides want to use the entire distribution chain. So having classical cable linear TV rights, but also then on-demand rights, IP rights, etc., different infrastructures, different use cases, is all part of the deal now, yes.
Okay, thanks for that. From Ian Nock at Fairmile West, what do you believe that a transition from traditional network platform delivery to OTT platform primary services will do to overall revenues for pay TV companies? Can I address that to Richard? And could you be brief, Richard?
Certainly. So, excellent question. I think in the short term, we'll see potentially revenue decline. So in some of the markets where we have seen cord cutting, the subscription online video services are cheaper. So people are swapping a high-price pay TV subscription for slightly cheaper online video subscription services. What some operators have started to do is obviously deploy their own, Now TV, via Play, all sorts of services like these, which some might argue would cannibalize their own subscription TV service, but they actually position themselves in the long term to take advantage of that consumer base that's shifting online. So perhaps in the short term we might see a short dip. I would argue that those pay TV operators are then going to be in a good position to recover revenues slightly longer term. Okay,
great. And a final one, actually from John Moulding at VideoNet. I seem to know this chap. Are Unity Media going to integrate other OTT services onto their platform, brackets beyond Maxdome? Daniel, that's for you, and I think it'll be our final question since we're almost out of time.
Well, John, as always, you're well informed. Yes, we do have Maxdome as a third-party OTT platform integrated already now. I can't really speak about, let's say, additional plans that we might have. Obviously, it is something that, well, it is in our mind. It is very attractive, obviously, to have further services on the platform. And you do see that in other platforms, competing platforms to ours, for example, at Deutsche Telekom, who do have, let's say, some additional OTT platforms on their own platform. In the end, I think it will be not a question of do I have this or do I have that, but it's a question of how well are they integrated in the overall user interface and guidance that I give to my customers.
Okay, thanks very much for answering that, Daniel. Okay, so we're just about out of time. What I'll like to do is to thank you, the audience, for your participation in this webinar from VideoNet and for all your questions, if belatedly. And special thanks to our three speakers, Matt Smith, Chief Evangelist at Envato, Dr. Daniel Hesselbart from Unity Media, and Richard Broughton, Research Director at Ampere Analysis. From them and from me, to all of you, the audience, goodbye and thank you.